The desert stretched in every direction like a vast graveyard of sand and stone, the August heat shimmering in waves that made the horizon dance. U.S. Marshal Jackson Morrison sat heavy in his saddle, the leather creaking under 61 years of muscle gone slack and bones that ached with every mile. His horse, a gray gelding named Sherman, after the general who'd burned Atlanta, picked its way through clusters of prickly pear and ocotillo while the sun beat down like a hammer on an anvil. 3 weeks. That's all that remained before the badge pinned to his vest became a relic to hang on some forgotten wall. 35 years he'd worn it, chasing killers from the Pecos to the Bitterroot. And what did he have to show for the decades? A rented room in Tucson that smelled of other men's tobacco, a bottle of whiskey that knew his nightmares better than any living soul, and a grave back in Texas with two names carved in granite that he couldn't bear to visit. The assignment was routine, the kind they gave to marshals counting down their final days. A supply wagon had vanished between Tombstone and Red Mesa, probably taken by bandits or lost to the unforgiving landscape. He was supposed to ride to Red Mesa, file a report with the local sheriff, collect his per diem, and ride back to Tucson to begin the slow rot of retirement. Simple, clean, forgettable. The cottonwood appeared first as a dark smudge against the bleached sky, its leaves somehow green despite the parched earth. Trees didn't grow alone in the Sonoran Desert without water nearby, which meant either a hidden spring or recent rain. As Sherman plodded closer, Jack noticed the branches, 7 thick limbs reaching out like the fingers of a giant hand, and from each limb hung a rope. At first he thought they were outlaws, strung up as a warning the way frontier justice sometimes worked in these lawless territories. Bandits caught red-handed, given a quick trial by vigilantes, left to twist in the wind as a message to others who might consider robbery or murder. But something was wrong with the scene. The bodies were too small, too slender, and they weren't swaying with the breeze the way corpses should. Jack dismounted 30 yards out, his hand dropping to the Colt at his hip, more from instinct than actual threat assessment. His knees protested the movement, arthritis singing in the joints like a rusty hinge. He'd taken a mini ball through the right kneecap at Gettysburg, had it dug out by a surgeon who was 3/4 drunk, and the joint had never properly healed. Some mornings he could barely walk. Today the pain was a dull throb, manageable but present, a reminder that his body was a machine wearing down to its component parts. The figures resolved into clarity as he approached. 7 women, their skin the deep bronze of Apache heritage, dressed in buckskin and cotton, that had seen better days. Nooses around their necks, feet dangling 6 inches above the sand. Their faces were dark, lips swollen, eyes closed. But something nagged at Jack's mind, some detail his years of investigating death had trained him to notice. The sand beneath their feet, fresh scratch marks, thin grooves made by toes desperately seeking purchase. And those marks were recent, made within the last hour if the wind patterns were any indication. He moved to the nearest body, a young woman who couldn't have been more than 25, placed 2 fingers against her throat where the noose bit into flesh, felt the faint flutter of a pulse, weak and thready, but undeniably present. His chest constricted, breath catching in a way that had nothing to do with the heat. They were alive. All of them, or most of them, clinging to consciousness by threads as thin as the ropes choking them. For a moment he stood paralyzed, the weight of what he'd found pressing down like the desert sun. This wasn't his jurisdiction. Apache affairs fell under the purview of the Bureau of Indian Affairs and the Army, not civilian law enforcement. The smart play was to ride on, report what he'd seen at the next town. Let someone else handle the mess. But then a hand shot out, fingers wrapping around his wrist with surprising strength. The young woman's eyes snapped open, dark as river stones, and her cracked lips moved. The word that emerged was barely a whisper, more breath than sound. Ayúdame. Spanish, not Apache. Help me. Jack's hands were moving before his brain caught up with the decision, pulling his knife from its sheath and sawing through the rope. The woman collapsed into his arms, dead weight that nearly took him down with her. He lowered her to the sand, already moving to the next rope, then the next, working with the methodical efficiency of a man who'd performed triage on Civil War battlefields, where the wounded outnumbered the surgeons 100 to 1. 7 cuts, 7 bodies laid out in a row on the scorching sand. He knelt beside each one, checking airways, feeling for pulses, making quick assessments of who would live and who was already too far gone. His canteen held maybe 2 cups of water, not nearly enough, but he rationed it out in careful sips, wetting lips and throats while his mind calculated distances and odds. The nearest settlement was Red Mesa, 15 miles northeast. Tucson was 40 miles south. He had 1 horse, 7 barely conscious women, and the sun would set in 4 hours. Moving them would kill the weakest. Leaving them would kill them all. The choice crystallized with sudden clarity. He'd set up camp here, use what supplies he had, and pray someone came along before dehydration or exposure claimed what the hanging hadn't finished. 2 hours later, he'd rigged a shelter using his bedroll and some dead mesquite branches, creating shade for the 7 women. His fire-starting kit produced a small blaze fed by dried cactus and creosote, and he'd set his coffee pot to boiling what little water remained in his canteen, making a thin broth from jerked beef that might give them some strength. The work kept his hands busy and his mind from wandering to darker questions, like who had done this and why. The oldest of the 7 regained consciousness first, her eyes opening to scan the makeshift camp with the alertness of a predator assessing territory. She was perhaps 27, with high cheekbones and a scar that ran from her left temple to her jawline, the kind of mark a knife made when it was meant to kill, but the target moved at the last second. She sat up slowly, one hand going to her throat where the rope had left a purple-black bruise. The other 6 women began to wake. Jack noticed the family resemblance among them, the shared features that marked them as sisters despite differences in age and bearing. Some were daughters of Dakota's first wife, killed in the massacre. Others from his second wife, who died years before the attack. 7 daughters from 2 mothers, bound by blood in 7 years of survival. Jack kept his distance, hands visible and empty, except for the tin cup of broth he extended in her direction. She studied him for a long moment, taking in the badge on his vest, the gray in his beard, the way he favored his right leg. Then she took the cup without a word and drank in small, careful sips. "You cut ropes." Her English carried an accent but was clear, each word chosen with precision. "Witawa," the question hung in the superheated air between them. Jack found himself reaching for an answer that made sense and coming up empty. Why had he stopped? Why risk his remaining time as a marshal on 7 Apache women who were probably wanted for something, or at minimum unwanted by whoever had strung them up? "Don't rightly know. Guess I'm tired of seeing the innocent hang." She set down the cup, her eyes never leaving his face. "You are lawman. We see badge." "I am, but law ain't always just." The silence that followed carried weight, an acknowledgement passing between them that needed no words. She turned her attention to the other 6 women, watching as they began to stir, checking each one with the practiced eye of someone who'd tended wounded before. The second woman to wake was smaller, lighter on her feet even in her weakened state. And she immediately moved to the edge of camp to study the ground with an intensity that suggested she was reading a story written in disturbed sand and bent grass. The third woman was the youngest, maybe 22, and when her eyes opened, they held a fury that age and circumstance hadn't dimmed. She tried to stand, staggered, and the oldest caught her with one arm. By the time all 7 were conscious and sipping broth, Jack had formed preliminary assessments based on 35 years of reading people the way card sharps read tells. The oldest was the leader, no question. The small one was a tracker, her eyes constantly moving, cataloging details others would miss. The young, angry one had a healer's hands, checking her sister's injuries with gentle competence, despite the rage burning behind her eyes. The fourth had a sniper's stillness, economy of movement that suggested patience and precision. The fifth carried herself like someone educated, someone who'd learned to navigate multiple worlds. The sixth moved like smoke, there and not there, the kind of person who could disappear in plain sight. And the seventh bore scars that spoke of close combat, of battles fought blade to blade, where the winner was whoever refused to quit. "You gonna tell me why someone wanted you dead, or do I gotta guess?" The leader finished her broth and set the cup aside with deliberate care. "Man who hang us wears badge too. Sheriff Marcus Thorne, Red Mesa." The name hit Jack like a fist to the solar plexus. Marcus Thorne. He'd met Thorne 2 years back at a U.S. Marshals Conference in Phoenix, had even shared a drink with the man. Thorne had been praised as the lawman of the year for Arizona Territory, credited with cleaning up Red Mesa and bringing order to a region that had been overrun with bandits and cattle rustlers. He was young for a sheriff, maybe 35, with the kind of clean-cut appearance and easy smile that made people trust him on sight. Thorne did this? Why did I? The leader reached into her boot and extracted a small piece of hide, no larger than a playing card, covered in symbols that meant nothing to Jack. She held it up to the fading light. For this. Before Jack could ask what it was, the sound of hooves cut through the desert stillness. His hand went to his Colt, thumb on the hammer, eyes scanning the horizon until he spotted the rider approaching from the west. Single horseman, moving at an easy canter, no attempt at stealth or speed. As the figure drew closer, Jack recognized the gray beard and the battered cavalry hat that had seen action in too many campaigns. Iron Jack Morrison, heard you were in the territory, came looking. Thomas Calloway, known as Red for the shock of hair that had since gone silver, dismounted with the stiffness of a man whose body remembered every mile it had traveled. 58 years old, former Texas Ranger, and one of the few men from Jack's Civil War company who'd survived long enough to collect gray hairs. They'd fought side by side at Gettysburg, had saved each other's lives at Antietam, and had maintained a friendship through the decades even as their paths diverged. Red, been a while. Red took in the scene with a single sweeping glance, his eyes lingering on the 7 Apache women and the ropes still dangling from the cottonwood branches. And you found yourself a mess, I see. The two men stood in the kind of comfortable silence that only came from shared trauma and mutual respect. Red pulled a canteen from his saddle and passed it around, the water inside still cool from being wrapped in damp cloth. The 7 women drank without asking permission, a fact that seemed to amuse Red more than offend him. You know these women? Red shook his head, but his expression suggested he knew something adjacent to the truth. Know of their people, Black River Apache, had a wife from their tribe 3 years back. She died of pneumonia, but before she passed, she told me stories about a massacre, about a chieftain named Dakota and his 7 daughters. The leader's head snapped up at the name, her hand moving instinctively toward a knife that wasn't there. You knew my people. Knew your pain. My wife, her name was Singing Bird. She was cousin to your father's 2nd wife. The revelation shifted something in the atmosphere of the camp, a subtle realignment of trust and suspicion. Red settled himself by the fire, pulling jerky from his saddlebags and passing it around with the casual generosity of a man who'd learned that sharing food built bridges faster than any amount of talk. I heard rumors. Callahan Mining been doing dirty work, forcing Apache off land, but Marcus Thorne being involved, that's a shock. Jack felt his jaw tighten at the name Callahan. Silas Callahan, owner of the largest silver mining operation in the territory, a man whose wealth had purchased influence in every courthouse and governor's office from here to Denver. If Callahan was connected to this, then the 7 women weren't just fighting a corrupt sheriff. They were going up against an empire. You know him? Red spat into the fire, a gesture that conveyed his opinion more clearly than words. Know of him. Never trusted him. Man's eyes too clean, like he practices his smile in a mirror. The tracker, the small woman who'd been studying the ground, suddenly stood and pointed toward the northeast. More coming, 3 riders, 2 hours. Jack strained his eyes against the glare but saw nothing except heat, shimmer, and empty desert. Red, however, nodded as if he'd expected exactly that. Jack, there's something you should know. That supply wagon you're looking for? Found it yesterday. Burned. 6 men dead. Cavalry's blaming Apache raiders. The young, angry woman's voice cut through the evening air like a blade. We've been hanging. How we raid wagons? Red's expression turned grim. Exactly. Someone's framing them. And I gotta guess who. As darkness settled over the desert, the 7 women gathered close to the fire while Jack and Red stood watch. The leader, who finally introduced herself as Kaya, began to speak in a low voice that carried the weight of memory too heavy to carry alone. We were Black River Apache, 87 people. My father, Dakota, was chieftain, good man, strong man. Jack listened while his imagination filled in details, painting a picture of a village not unlike the settlements he'd protected during the war. Families cooking over open fires, children playing games that had been played for generations, old folks weaving baskets and telling stories that kept history alive. White man came, running from Texas Rangers. Name Marcus Thorne. He had bullet in shoulder. We could have let him die. Father said no. We heal him. Red's voice was quiet but carried an edge. Your father made him blood, brother? Kaya's surprise was evident even in the firelight. You know ceremony? My wife taught me. The silence that followed held the weight of shared understanding, of traditions that transcended the boundaries drawn by men in distant offices. Kaya continued, her words coming slower now, each sentence a stone laid on a cairn of grief. Thorne lived with us 6 months, learned our language, ate our food, played with children. Father trusted him, taught him everything. A figure emerged from the darkness beyond the firelight, moving so silently that Jack's hand was on his Colt before Red raised a hand in a calming gesture. The man who stepped into the light was old, perhaps 65, with silver hair worn long and eyes that had witnessed horrors beyond counting. His face carried the weathered dignity of Apache elders, but there was something broken in the set of his shoulders, a grief that had settled into his bones like arthritis. Easy, he's with me. The old man settled by the fire without invitation, his presence commanding respect through silence rather than speech. When he finally spoke, his English was perfect, each word articulated with the precision of someone who'd been educated at mission schools. I am Samuel Whitehorse. Dakota is my younger brother, was my younger brother. Kaya's breath caught, a sound that might have been a sob if she'd allowed herself such weakness. Uncle. Samuel's eyes found each of the 7 women in turn, recognition and pain warring across his features. I was hunting when it happened, 50 miles to the north, tracking elk. By the time I returned, the village was ash and bones. Jack had investigated enough massacres to know the signs, the patterns of violence that repeated themselves across the frontier with depressing regularity. But something in Samuel's tone suggested this had been different. Not the random brutality of a raid, but something calculated and cold. I will tell you what the girls cannot bear to speak, what the survivors told me before they died in Callahan's mines. The night had grown cold the way desert nights did, temperature plunging 30 degrees as the earth released the day's stored heat into a sky so clear the stars seemed close enough to touch. Samuel's voice dropped to a register that made everyone lean closer, drawn in by the gravity of what he was about to reveal. It was not random. Thorne opened the south fence at 10 that evening. 40 men rode in, led by Silas Callahan himself, dressed in a fine suit like he was attending theater. They came for the hide map. The firelight cast Samuel's face in harsh relief, shadows pooling in the lines that grief had carved. Callahan wanted what my brother protected, the map to everything white men covet, water sources that have sustained our people for 400 years, silver veins never claimed by any prospector's stake, and most importantly, the location of our sacred burial grounds where the treaty is hidden. Jack's attention sharpened at the word treaty. Red leaned forward, his expression confirming that he'd heard rumors of such a document. Treaty between Apache Nation and the United States government, signed by President Polk himself in 1848, guarantees 500,000 acres in perpetuity, never ratified by Senate because the senators had friends who wanted that land. But presidential signature carries legal weight if the document can be found and authenticated. The implications cascaded through Jack's mind like dominoes falling. If such a treaty existed and could be proven legitimate, Callahan's entire mining operation would be illegal. Every ounce of silver pulled from the earth would be stolen property. The land grants issued by the territorial governor would be void. Fortunes built on Apache land would crumble like sandcastles in a flood. My brother Dakota refused to give up the map, so Callahan ordered Thorne to persuade him. Samuel's hands were shaking now, the only visible sign of the emotion roiling beneath his stoic exterior. Thorne took my brother's wife, Winona's mother, and cut her throat while Dakota watched. Asked again about the map. My brother spat blood in Thorne's face. One of the 7 women, the one Jack had identified as educated, let out a sound that might have been a whimper. Her face remained impassive, but tears tracked silently down her cheeks. They killed everyone over 40. Too old to work. Killed everyone under 10. Too young to be useful. The 14 who remained, those between 10 and 40, were taken to the mines, worked them until they died. The last survivor passed 3 weeks ago. Before he went, he told me something I did not believe until I saw these 7 alive. Samuel's eyes found Kaya's across the fire. Dakota still lives. Thorne keeps him in a cage beneath the sheriff's office in Red Mesa. Has been torturing him for 7 years, waiting for him to break and reveal the map's location. The reaction was immediate and visceral. Kaya stood so fast she knocked over her cup, the youngest woman's hand flying to her mouth, the others frozen in various states of shock and disbelief. Jack watched the information ripple through them like a shockwave, upending everything they believed about their father's fate. He lives? Kaya's voice was barely recognizable, stripped of the iron control she'd maintained since waking. He lives, barely, but yes. The tracker, the small woman, turned to Jack with eyes that blazed in the firelight. You help us free him? It was a question that carried the weight of a demand, an expectation, and a plea all braided together. Jack looked at Red, then at Samuel, then at the 7 women who'd survived horrors that would have broken most men he knew. His hand drifted to the badge on his chest, fingers tracing the edges of the star that had defined him for longer than some of these women had been alive. I'm a federal marshal. My jurisdiction is anywhere justice is needed. The voice came from beyond the firelight, young and earnest, and Jack's hand dropped to his Colt even as a figure stepped into view, with hands raised high. The newcomer couldn't have been more than 25 odd, clean-shaven with the kind of optimistic expression that life in the territories usually beat out of men within their first year. He wore a deputy marshal's badge, new enough to still shine. Don't shoot. I'm not with Thorne. Jack kept his gun drawn but lowered, taking in the kid's appearance with the assessment of a man who'd seen too many young marshals get themselves killed by walking into situations they didn't understand. You're wearing a badge. Federal marshal out of Denver, name's James Parker. I was sent here to investigate Sheriff Thorne based on a telegraph complaint sent 6 months ago. Parker's eyes found Samuel's face. That was you, wasn't it? The unsigned telegram claiming a territorial sheriff was operating a slave labor camp? Samuel nodded once, a slight movement that confirmed what everyone had already guessed. Took them long enough to send someone. Parker's expression flickered between embarrassment and defensiveness. Bureau moves slow, but I'm here now, and I need help. Marshal Morrison, I read your file. You're a legend, 35 years of service, highest solve rate in the Western Territories. I'm in over my head here, and I know it. Thorne has 30 men. Callahan owns the territorial governor. I got me, a badge, and a mandate that's worth less than the paper it's printed on unless I can find an evidence that'll stand up in federal court. Jack studied the kid, seeing himself 3 decades ago, when he'd still believed the system worked, when he'd thought justice and law were synonyms instead of sometimes enemies. There was something painfully earnest about Parker, a quality that the frontier would either forge into steel or shatter into fragments. You know what you're walking into? Corrupt sheriff, mining tycoon with political connections. Probably gonna get me killed. The kid's honesty was almost refreshing in its naked acknowledgement of reality. But if I don't try, what's the badge for? Jack looked down at his own badge, the metal worn smooth from years of handling. He thought about Sarah and Emma, about the graves in Texas he couldn't visit without drowning in whiskey afterward. Thought about 35 years of chasing outlaws and hanging killers and telling himself he was building civilization in the wilderness. And he thought about what Red had said once after too much whiskey and too many memories, that maybe civilization was just the name powerful men gave to their theft. His fingers found the pin that secured the badge to his vest. For a moment, he just stood there, feeling the weight of it, the history, the identity it represented. Then with deliberate slowness, he unpinned it and held it up to catch the firelight. Wore this for 35 years, chased outlaws from Texas to Montana, hanged killers, Thought I was bringing law and order to the frontier. He turned the badge in his fingers, watching light play across its surface. But maybe I was just helping the powerful steal from the powerless and calling it progress. Kaya stood, her hand extended in the Apache gesture of respect between warriors. You have honor, old man. Jack looked at her hand, then at the 6 other women, at Samuel and Red and young Parker with his shining badge and his dangerous optimism. He thought about walking away, about those 3 weeks until retirement, about the quiet death that waited in a Tucson boarding house. And he thought about Emma, about what kind of man she would have wanted him to be. You're going after Thorne? We are going to kill him. Not kill, bring to justice. Kaya's eyes narrowed. Justice is death. Maybe, but it's got to be done right. Legal, public, so the next Thorne thinks twice. He extended his hand not in the Apache gesture, but in the way men sealed bargains on the frontier. After a moment's hesitation, Kaya gripped it, her calloused palm pressing against his. You want my help? Here's the deal. We do this by the law. Gather evidence, build a case, arrest Thorne properly. And if law fails? Jack met her eyes and saw the same fury that burned in his own chest whenever he thought about Sarah and Emma. Then we do it the Apache way. Red's chuckle was dry as desert sand. So we got 3 lawmen, 1 elder, and 7 warriors. 11 against an army. I've been in worse odds. Samuel's voice carried the weight of generations. What do we believe in? The question hung in the air, demanding an answer that went deeper than tactics or strategy. Kaya spoke first, her words simple but freighted with meaning. We believe the innocent should not hang. Everyone nodded, even Parker. And in that moment, they became something more than a random collection of people thrown together by circumstance. They became a unit, bound by purpose, if not yet by trust. So what's the plan? Jack was already thinking 3 moves ahead, cataloging assets and liabilities the way he'd learned on battlefields where a wrong decision meant death. First, we get evidence. Second, we rescue your father. Third, we find that treaty. Fourth, we bring Thorne to justice. And fifth, we pray we live long enough to do all 4. Red had been watching the horizon while the others talked, his tracker's instincts alert to movement in the darkness. Now he stiffened, one hand raising in the cavalry signal for danger. Might want to pray faster. We got riders, 15 of them, coming hard from the northeast. Jack pulled his spyglass from his saddlebag and scanned the direction Red indicated. Even in the darkness, he could make out the shapes, horses being pushed fast, riders bent low in their saddles. And in the center of the group, silhouetted against the rising moon, was a distinctive figure he recognized from that conference 2 years ago. Tall, broad-shouldered, sitting a horse like he owned it and everything beneath it, Marcus Thorne. And behind him, mounted on a wagon being pulled by 4 horses, was the unmistakable silhouette of a Gatling gun. The mission ruins sat 3 miles east, adobe walls half collapsed from a century of neglect since Spanish priests had abandoned their attempts to convert the Apache. Jack led the group through darkness, moving fast despite his protesting knee, while Red covered their rear trail and the tracker woman, whose name was Naira, erased their tracks with mesquite branches. 15 horses made noise. 11 people on foot, guided by those who knew how to move like wind through grass, made none. They reached the crumbling compound an hour before Thorne's riders would arrive, time bought by taking a route that avoided the easy paths. The mission formed a rough square around a central courtyard, its bell tower still standing, despite a roof that had caved in decades ago. Jack climbed the tower's interior stairs, testing each stone step before committing his weight, until he reached the top platform where Spanish sentries had once watched for Comanche raids. The view stretched for miles in every direction under moonlight bright enough to read by. He could see Thorne's dust cloud closer now and counted the horses again to be sure. 15 riders, the Gatling gun on its wagon. Maybe 1,000 rounds of ammunition if they'd brought the standard load, against 11 defenders, most of whom were exhausted from nearly dying by hanging just hours ago. Red joined him on the platform, moving with the caution of a man who understood structural integrity. This place won't hold against that kind of firepower. Doesn't have to hold, just has to buy time. Time for what? Jack pulled his pocket watch and checked the time by moonlight. 2:15 in the morning. Cavalry patrol out of Fort Grant passes through Skeleton Canyon every morning at 0600. That's 4 hours. We make noise, they hear it, they investigate. That's a lot of ifs. Got a better plan? Red's silence was answer enough. They descended to find the others already fortifying positions. Samuel had found the old mission's cistern, still holding a few inches of stagnant water that could be boiled if needed. Parker was distributing ammunition from his saddlebags, his hands shaking slightly in a way that said he'd never been in a real gunfight. The 7 women moved through the ruins like they'd been born in them, Kea directing her sisters with hand signals that needed no translation. Jack gathered everyone in the courtyard where a single mesquite tree had somehow found purchase in cracked flagstones. Thorne's got numbers and a Gatling gun. We've got walls and elevation. Red and Samuel, take the bell tower. You're our long rifles. Parker, you're with me on the south wall. Kaya, position your sisters where you think best. But remember, we're trying to hold ground, not win glory. Kaya's expression suggested she had her own ideas about glory, but she nodded. We do not take orders easily. I've been in more sieges than you've been alive, girl. You want your father back? You trust me for the next 4 hours, then argue with me later. The moment hung between them, pride and pragmatism locked in silent combat. Then Kaya turned to her sisters and began speaking in rapid Apache, her hands moving in gestures that Jack recognized as tactical deployment. Within minutes, the women had scattered to positions that covered every approach, their forms melting into shadows so completely that Jack lost track of where most of them were. Kid's got tactical sense. Red's observation came from beside Jack's shoulder. Learned it from her father, probably. In 7 years of staying alive when everyone wanted her dead tends to sharpen survival instincts. You really think we can hold? Jack looked at his old friend, seeing the doubt that experience had earned him. They'd held Cemetery Ridge at Gettysburg against Pickett's charge, had watched Confederate artillery turn the sky to thunder and the ground to hell. They'd survived, but survival wasn't the same as victory, and both men carried the scars to prove it. We held at Gettysburg. We had 10,000 men and artillery support. We also believed in the cause. Question is, what do we believe now? Red's answer was cut off by a shout from beyond the walls, Thorne's voice amplified by desert acoustics and the arrogance of men who thought they'd already won. Morrison, I know you're in there. Federal Marshal helping Apache outlaws. That's treason. Jack moved to a gap in the south wall where he could see without being seen. Thorne sat his horse 60 yards out, just beyond effective rifle range, flanked by his 15 men. The Gatling gun had been positioned on a small rise, its crew already loading ammunition belts. I ain't helping outlaws. I'm protecting citizens from a corrupt lawman. Thorne's laugh carried contempt and certainty. Citizens? Those are savages, murderers. They killed 17 good men over the past 7 years. Samuel's voice rang out from the bell tower, steady and clear. Marcus Thorne, you killed my brother's wife. You enslaved my people. Face me like a man instead of hiding behind hired guns. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the nervous shifting of horses. Jack watched Thorne's posture change, shoulders stiffening in a way that said Samuel's words had struck home. Samuel Whitehorse, still alive. I thought the mines would have finished you by now. Don't worry, old man. I'll correct that mistake tonight. The Gatling gun opened up without further warning, its distinctive mechanical chatter shredding the night. Bullets tore through adobe like paper, spraying the courtyard with fragments of clay and stone. Jack threw himself flat, covering his head as debris rained down. The gun fired in sustained bursts, each one eating through walls that had stood for a century, reducing architecture to rubble. Red and Samuel returned fire from the tower, their rifles barking in careful rhythm. Jack saw one of Thorne's men tumble from his saddle, then another. Parker was firing too, his shots wild but enthusiastic, learning the difference between range practice and combat where targets shot back. The Gatling gun swiveled toward the tower, and Jack's stomach clenched as he imagined Red and Samuel torn apart by that mechanical fury. But the gun suddenly stopped, its crew scrambling away from the weapon. Jack couldn't see what had caused the retreat until moonlight glinted off an arrow shaft protruding from the ammunition belt, jamming the feed mechanism. One of the 7 women, the sniper who moved with that patient stillness, had made an impossible shot in darkness from 100 yards away. "Ceasefire!" Thorne's bellow cut through the chaos. The shooting stopped, leaving ringing silence and the smell of cordite heavy in the air. Jack did a quick count of his people. Parker was bleeding from a scalp wound. Nothing serious, but head wounds bled like fountains. Samuel was still in the tower. Red was reloading. The 7 women were invisible, which meant they were either dead or exactly where they needed to be. "Morrison, I got something you want." Jack risked a look over the wall. 2 of Thorne's men were dragging someone forward. An old Apache man whose body bore the marks of prolonged torture. Missing fingers. Scars crisscrossing his back. One eye socket empty and scarred. But he held himself with dignity despite the chains that bound his wrists and ankles. Samuel's cry from the tower was pure anguish. "Dakota! That's right, your precious chieftain. Been keeping him comfortable for 7 years in my cellar." Thorne's voice carried the satisfaction of a man holding the only card that mattered. "Here's the deal, Marshal. You hand over the 7 girls. I let Dakota live. Everyone else walks free. You got my word as a lawman." Jack's mind raced through scenarios and probabilities. Thorne's word was worth less than spit in a sandstorm, but the threat was real. If they didn't negotiate, Dakota would die in front of his daughters. If they did negotiate, Thorne would kill them all anyway once he had what he wanted. The only play was to shift the board entirely. "Counteroffer, you release Dakota. Turn yourself in. I'll make sure you get a fair trial." Thorne's laughter was genuine, the kind that came from real amusement. "Fair trial in whose court? Callahan owns every judge in the territory. I'll walk free in a week and you know it." Parker's voice was quiet beside Jack, pitched for his ears only. "He's right. Territorial courts are bought and paid for. I've seen the records. Every case against Callahan Mining dismissed on technicalities." Jack's jaw clenched hard enough to make his teeth ache. He'd spent 35 years believing the system worked if you just followed the rules. But the rules were written by men like Callahan and enforced by men like Thorne. And the only justice available was the kind you made yourself. Samuel's whisper drifted down from the tower. "Let me go. Trade me for my brother." "No. I am old. He has daughters who need him. No one else dies. Not on my watch." Movement at the edge of his vision. Naira, the tracker, had slipped out through a collapsed section of the east wall during the ceasefire. Jack hadn't seen her go, didn't know she was gone until she reappeared 30 minutes later from a completely different direction, moving like smoke through the pre-dawn darkness. She came to Kaya and the 2 women engaged in rapid conversation, their voices too low for Jack to hear. Then Kaya turned to him. "Thorne has only 8 men left with him. 7 ran when the Gatling jammed. Dakota is chained to the ammunition wagon. 4 guards." Jack studied her in the growing light of false dawn, this young woman who'd survived hanging and was now planning an assault that would likely get her killed. "You got a plan?" "We take him back." The simplicity of it was both beautiful and terrifying. No complex strategy, no clever maneuvering, just direct action with all the subtlety of a cavalry charge. Jack looked at Red, who'd descended from the tower to hear the plan. "Thoughts?" "I think these women have been fighting this war a lot longer than we have. Maybe we follow their lead." Kaya laid it out in quick, efficient terms. 3 of her sisters would circle behind Thorne's position, using the darkness and their knowledge of silent movement to eliminate the guards around Dakota. Jack and Red would provide a frontal distraction, drawing fire and attention. The remaining 3 women and Samuel would extract Dakota while Parker provided sniper cover from the tower. It was a plan built on desperate hope and the assumption that Apache stealth was superior to hired gun awareness. Jack had seen worse plans succeed and better plans fail catastrophically. The difference usually came down to luck and the willingness to pay the price of failure. "We do this, people will die. Maybe us, maybe them, probably both." Kaya's eyes held no illusion or hesitation. "People already dead. We just decide how many more join them." Jack pulled his Colt, checked the cylinder, and holstered it again. The action was ritual, muscle memory, from 1,000 similar moments over 3.5 decades. His hands were steady despite the tremor age had introduced. The same hands that had held Sarah on their wedding day and dug Emma's grave in Texas hardpan. All right, on my signal. He waited until the sky had lightened to that peculiar gray that wasn't quite day, but no longer night, when depth perception played tricks and shadows could be anything. Then he stood, fully exposed on the ruined wall, and raised both hands. I'm coming out! To talk! Thorne's men shifted nervously, rifles tracking Jack's movement as he climbed down from the wall and walked toward them with his arms raised high. Every instinct screamed that this was suicide, that he was giving Thorne exactly what the corrupt sheriff wanted. But the plan required faith, and faith required risk. That's far enough, Morrison. Jack stopped 20 yards from Thorne's position, close enough to see the man's face in the growing light. Thorne looked tired, his clean-cut appearance marred by dust and the kind of tension that came from plans going wrong. Behind him, chained to the wagon like an animal, Dakota watched with his one remaining eye. You're making a mistake, Marcus. It's not too late to do the right thing. The right thing? I am doing the right thing. This territory was chaos before men like me and Callahan brought order. You want to throw that away for 7 Apache women who've killed good white men? Those good white men were torturing children in silver mines. I'd hardly call that good. Thorne's hand dropped to his revolver, and Jack knew the moment of talking was over. But talking had never been the point. Talking was distraction. The first guard around the wagon died silently, throat cut by Chenoa, the woman who moved like smoke. The second died with an arrow through his eye, Liluyeh's impossible accuracy turning moonlight into death. The third and fourth guards died simultaneously, Nera and one of the others, whose name Jack still didn't know, executing them with the synchronized precision of wolves taking down prey. Thorne spun at the sound of bodies falling, his revolver clearing leather. But Red's rifle spoke first, and Thorne's hat flew off his head. Not a kill shot, just a warning that said the next one would count. Chaos erupted as Thorne's remaining men opened fire, muzzle flashes strobing the pre-dawn darkness. Jack dropped flat and rolled, coming up with his Colt in hand, firing at shapes and sounds rather than clear targets. A bullet cracked past his ear, close enough to feel the displaced air. Another kicked up dust by his boot. He emptied his cylinder into the mass of riders, saw one man fall, then he was reloading while scrambling for cover behind a boulder. Samuel appeared beside the wagon, ancient but moving with purpose, his hands working at the chains that bound Dakota. The old man carried his brother across his shoulders in a fireman's carry that shouldn't have been possible for someone his age. But desperation and love made men capable of impossible things. Kaya and Ayasha materialized from nowhere to cover their retreat, knives flashing in the growing light. Parker was firing from the tower, each shot carefully placed, and Jack saw 2 more of Thorne's men go down. The numbers were shifting. 15 to start, now maybe 6 or 7 still fighting. But those 6 had better positions and more ammunition. And the Gatling gun crew was working frantically to clear the jam mechanism. A bullet caught Jack's left arm, punching through the meat below his shoulder and exiting clean. The pain was immediate and electric, nerves screaming, but he'd been shot before and knew how to compartmentalize. He switched his Colt to his right hand and kept firing, advancing on Thorne's position because standing still in a gunfight was how you died. Red was beside him suddenly, the 2 old soldiers moving in the unconscious coordination of men who'd fought together before. They laid down suppressing fire while the 7 women and Samuel retreated with Dakota toward the mission. The Gatling gun roared back to life, its crew having cleared the jam, and the world turned into flying lead and stone fragments. Jack felt something punch his ribs, looked down to see blood spreading across his shirt, but there was no pain yet, so he kept moving. Red grabbed his good arm and hauled him behind cover, their backs pressed against what remained of the mission's outer wall. "You're hit!" "I noticed." "How bad?" Jack probed the wound with his fingers, felt the bullet lodged against a rib. Painful but not immediately fatal if he could avoid infection. "I'll live." The Gatling gun was chewing through the wall above their heads, each burst walking closer to their position. They had maybe seconds before the weapon traversed far enough to turn them into hamburger. Jack looked at Red and saw his own acceptance reflected in his friend's eyes. They'd survived Gettysburg. That was enough for one lifetime. Then the Gatling gun stopped, its mechanical chatter dying mid-burst. Jack risked a glance and saw Thorne's crew scrambling away from the weapon, flames licking from the ammunition hopper. Someone, probably one of the women, had shot a flaming arrow into the ammunition supply. The resulting fire was spreading fast, consuming belts of cartridges that started cooking off in random directions. Thorne was screaming orders, but his men were breaking, survival instinct overcoming loyalty or pay. They scattered on horseback, riding hard for anywhere that wasn't here. In seconds, Thorne was alone, except for two die-hard loyalists who either believed in his cause or were too stupid to recognize defeat. Jack climbed to his feet, swaying slightly from blood loss, his Colt steady despite the tremor in his hand. He walked toward Thorne, closing the distance. Watching the corrupt sheriff's face transition from arrogance to uncertainty to something approaching fear. "It's over, Marcus. Your men ran. Your guns burning. Surrender and live to see trial." Thorne's revolver came up fast, but Jack was faster despite his age and wounds. His shot took Thorne in the right shoulder, spinning the man and sending his gun flying. The two loyalists tried to raise their rifles, but Red's shot caught one in the chest, while Parker's bullet, fired from the tower, took the other in the leg. Silence descended like a curtain, broken only by the crackle of burning ammunition and the heavy breathing of exhausted combatants. Jack approached Thorne, who was clutching his shoulder and cursing in a steady stream of profanity that suggested the wound hurt more than it endangered. "Marcus Thorne, you're under arrest for murder, slavery, attempted murder of federal officers, and about 15 other charges I'll think of while we ride." Thorne's laugh was bitter. "You'll never make it stick. Callahan owns the governor, owns the judges, owns everyone who matters. I'll be free before you can file the paperwork." Parker snapped the manacles shut around Thorne's wrists, the metallic click echoing in the morning stillness. The corrupt sheriff tested the restraints once, then went still, his eyes tracking toward the horizon as if calculating odds of rescue. "Callahan won't let this stand. He'll come for you." Jack followed Thorne's gaze, seeing nothing but heat shimmer in empty desert. But the words carried the weight of prophecy. Silas Callahan hadn't built his empire by abandoning useful tools, and Thorne had been his most effective instrument for 7 years. "Let him come. We'll be waiting." Red appeared with rope to bind Thorne's ankles for the ride back. The corrupt sheriff would travel on horseback, hands and feet secured, flanked by armed guards. No chances, no mercy. What about Callahan? Parker's question held an edge of nervousness. He's still out there, still has his private army. Samuel's voice was quiet but certain. Callahan is not warrior. He hides behind men like Thorne. Without his sheriff, he will hire others. Bounty hunters, mercenaries, anyone whose loyalty can be bought. Kaya checked her knife, her expression grim. Then we prepare for what comes next. Parker appeared, his young face set in grim lines, holding a pair of manacles. Maybe territorial courts are corrupt, but federal court isn't. And we've got enough evidence now to take this all the way to Denver. Inside the mission, Dakota lay on a blanket while Ayasha tended his wounds with herbs and water. The old chieftain's face was peaceful despite the pain, his one good eye finding each of his 7 daughters in turn. Samuel knelt beside his brother, speaking in Apache too rapidly for Jack to follow. Kea approached Jack while he sat against a wall, letting Red wrap his wounds with strips torn from someone's shirt. "You fought well for old white man. You survived well for someone who was supposed to be dead." She settled onto her heels beside him, studying his face the way she might study terrain before a battle. "What happens now?" "Now we gather evidence. Document everything. Find that treaty if we can. Build a case that even Callahan's money can't buy. And if we cannot?" Jack met her eyes and saw in them the same question he'd been asking himself since Sarah and Emma died. "Then we make sure justice happens anyway. One way or another." The sun was fully up now, painting the desert in shades of gold and amber. In the distance, dust rose from approaching riders. Jack tensed until he recognized the cavalry guidon, blue and gold, flying above a column of 40 soldiers. The patrol from Fort Grant had heard the gunfire and come to investigate. Their commander was a colonel named Harrington, 48 years old, with the weathered face of a career soldier. He surveyed the scene with professional detachment, taking in the bodies, the burning Gatling gun, the wounded chieftain, and the 7 Apache women. "Marshal Morrison, that's me. You're under arrest, charge aiding and abetting known outlaws, assaulting a lawful peace officer, treason against the United States." Jack had known this was coming, had accepted it as the price of his choices. He raised his hands, wincing as the movement pulled at his wounds. "On whose authority?" Harrington produced a paper with an official seal. "Territorial Governor. Signed warrant this morning." Parker stepped forward, his badge catching sunlight. "Colonel, I'm Federal Deputy Marshal James Parker. I can explain. You're under arrest too, son. Same charges." Harrington's eyes found the 7 women, and these 7 are wanted for murder of 17 white men. They'll hang at Fort Grant. Kaya's hand moved toward the knife at her belt, but Jack caught her wrist and shook his head fractionally. 40 cavalry troopers with loaded rifles wasn't a fight they could win, and trying would only get everyone killed. "Colonel, I'm asking you, soldier to soldier, give me 5 minutes to explain." Harrington studied Jack's face, noting the weathered lines, the old scars, the bearing that identified another military man. "You served?" "Gettysburg, Antietam, Chancellorsville, 1st Minnesota Regiment." Something shifted in Harrington's expression, a subtle softening that suggested shared experience meant something even in this corner of hell. "I was at Gettysburg too, different division." "You have 3 minutes. Make them count." Jack used every second. He explained about the treaty, about Callahan's illegal mining operation, about the massacre 7 years ago, and the slave labor camp. He showed Harrington the tortured body of Dakota. "Let Samuel testify about the 14 Apache who died in the mines." Parker produced a leather document case and handed it to Harrington. "This is the 1848 treaty signed by President Polk, never ratified by Senate, but presidential executive orders have force of law unless explicitly overturned. This was never overturned." Harrington's lawyer, a captain who served as judge advocate, examined the document with the care of a man who understood that words on paper could topple empires. "This appears authentic, but nothing, Captain. Check the seal, check the signatures. That's President Polk's hand, verified by handwriting analysis I had done in Denver before I came down here. If that treaty is legitimate, and I believe it is, then every acre Callahan Mining operates on is stolen Apache land." Harrington looked from the treaty to Dakota to the 7 women who stood ready to fight or die depending on what he decided next. "Even if this is all true, I have orders from the governor. Governor is Callahan's creature, bought and paid for." "That may be, but I'm a soldier. I follow orders." The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then Harrington did something unexpected. He smiled, though there was no humor in it. "However, I can delay execution of those orders until I receive confirmation from Washington. That'll take about 2 weeks. Telegraph is mysteriously down, you see. Technical difficulties." Jack understood immediately what the colonel was offering. 2 weeks to build their case, to gather evidence, to find witnesses who'd testify. 2 weeks before the machinery of Callahan's corruption could grind them all to dust. "What happens after 2 weeks? After 2 weeks, I have to arrest you, unless Callahan and Thorne are already in federal custody facing charges. Then the governor's warrant becomes moot. Federal jurisdiction supersedes territorial." Red's voice carried appreciation for a clever bureaucratic maneuver. "You're giving us 2 weeks to bring them in?" "I'm not giving you anything. I'm simply experiencing technical difficulties with my communications equipment. We'll camp here tonight. In the morning, we ride to Fort Grant, very slowly, taking the long route, stopping to water the horses frequently." Harrington extended his hand to Jack, and they shook with the understanding of men who'd both seen what happened when the powerful crushed the powerless and called it civilization. "Get me evidence I can use. Real evidence, documents, witnesses, something that'll stand up in federal court and can't be dismissed by a bought judge. Do that, and I'll see you get a fair hearing." That night, while cavalry sentries patrolled the perimeter and Harrington's men made camp, Jack's makeshift army gathered around a fire that felt too exposed after everything they'd survived. Dakota was sleeping, sedated with something Ayasha had mixed from desert plants. Samuel sat watch over his brother with the devotion of a man who'd spent 7 years believing he'd failed in his duty to protect family. Red cleaned his rifle, the repetitive motion soothing after combat's chaos. Parker was writing everything down in careful script, building his case one documented fact at a time. The 7 women sat together, speaking in Apache too rapidly for Jack to follow, planning something he suspected he wouldn't approve of if he understood. Kaya broke away from her sisters and settled beside Jack, watching him clean and reload his Colt with the one-handed competence of a man who'd done it 1,000 times. Your wounds need better care. They'll keep. Will you? The question carried weight beyond its simple phrasing. Would he keep going? Would he see this through despite pain and age and the very real possibility that he'd die before reaching any kind of justice? Jack thought about Sarah and Emma, about graves in Texas he'd never visit again, about 35 years wearing a badge and believing it meant something, about the choice he'd made when he unpinned that badge and threw it in the fire of his old certainties. I gave you my word. I keep my promises. Even when keeping them kills you, especially then. What kind of man would I be otherwise? Kaya was quiet for a long moment, staring into flames that painted her scarred face in shifting orange light. My father used to say, the measure of a man is what he does when no one is watching and nothing is gained by doing right. Your father sounds like a wise man. He was, is, will be again if we succeed. Jack holstered his Colt and met her eyes. We'll succeed. Question is what it costs us. Everything costs something. We just decide if the price is worth paying. In the morning, they would ride toward Fort Grant and the confrontation with Callahan's empire that waited beyond. But for now, in this moment, 11 people who'd been strangers days ago sat together around a fire and became something more. Became family forged not in blood, but in shared conviction that the innocent deserve protection even when the law couldn't provide it. Became the last thing Silas Callahan would ever see coming. The ride to Fort Grant took 3 days under Colonel Harrington's deliberately slow pace, each mile eating time they couldn't afford to waste. Jack's wounds festered despite Ayasha's poultices, infection creeping into tissue with the inevitability of desert sunrise. Red changed his bandages twice daily, grimacing at the spreading redness, but saying nothing because both men understood that complaints accomplished nothing. Parker spent the journey interviewing everyone who'd survived the mission fight, documenting testimonies in his careful legal script. He'd requisitioned paper from Harrington's quartermaster and filled page after page with statements, affidavits, descriptions of evidence. The young marshal attacked bureaucracy with the same earnest intensity he'd shown under fire, believing that proper procedure could accomplish what bullets sometimes couldn't. Dakota recovered slowly, each small improvement a victory hard won against 7 years of torture. The first 2 days he barely moved, his body shutting down as if unsure whether freedom was real or another cruel trick. Ayasha tended him constantly, treating infections, forcing liquids past cracked lips, cleaning wounds that had festered for years. By the third, he was speaking in halting sentences, teaching his daughters words he'd thought he'd never share. Samuel rode close to his brother, the 2 old men communicating in Apache in silence, rebuilding bonds that torture had strained but not broken. The 7 women ranged ahead and behind the column, scouts by instinct and training. Kaya had explained their formation to Jack on the first night, how each sister covered a specific sector based on her skills. Naira tracked forward. Liluye watched their back trail from high ground. Chinoa swept flanks for ambush. The pattern was military in its precision, learned through 7 years of staying alive when the world wanted them dead. Fort Grant materialized from heat shimmer on the afternoon of the 3rd day, an island of federal authority and territorial chaos. Stone walls 20 feet high, guard towers at each corner. A garrison of 200 soldiers whose loyalty was to Washington rather than the territorial governor. Harrington had chosen this destination carefully, Jack realized. Whatever happened next would happen under federal jurisdiction where Callahan's influence was diluted, if not eliminated. The post commander was a general named Whitmore, 62 years old with iron gray hair and eyes that had seen campaigns from Mexico to the Dakotas. He received them in his office, a Spartan room where the only decoration was a portrait of Ulysses Grant. Jack laid out the case while Whitmore listened without interruption. The massacre, the mines, the treaty, Thorne's arrest. Parker presented his documentation, 3 days of compiled evidence that painted a picture of systematic corruption enabled by territorial officials. Whitmore studied the 1848 treaty for long minutes, his expression revealing nothing. If this is authentic, it's the most significant legal document in Arizona territory. It invalidates every land grant Callahan holds, potentially costs him millions. That's why he's been trying to destroy it for 7 years. And you're certain Callahan ordered the massacre? Samuel spoke from where he stood beside the wall, too proud to sit in the general's presence. I saw him there, in his fine suit, watching while Thorne murdered my brother's wife. He gave the orders. Whitmore's attention shifted to the old Apache. You'd testify to that in federal court? I would swear it on the graves of my ancestors. The general leaned back, his chair creaking. Here's my problem. You're asking me to arrest the wealthiest man in the territory based on testimony from Apache witnesses and a treaty that's never been tested in court. Callahan has lawyers, political connections, friends in Washington. Even if I arrest him, even if we go to trial, there's no guarantee of conviction. Jack felt the familiar frustration rising, the same helpless rage he'd experienced when Sarah and Emma's killers walked free on legal technicalities. So we did all this for nothing? Dakota's been tortured for 7 years. 73 Apache murdered. Children worked to death in mines. And justice is still unavailable because the guilty can afford better lawyers? Whitmore's expression hardened. Don't lecture me about justice, Marshal. I've enforced it in places where the only law was what I said it was. But we're not in the field now. We're in American territory where due process matters. Due process for the rich. For everyone else, there's just the process of dying and hoping someone remembers you existed. The silence that followed was broken by an unexpected voice. Winona, the educated daughter who'd remained quiet throughout most of the journey, stepped forward. General Whitmore, may I speak? The general's surprise was evident, but he nodded. You speak English well. I was educated at the mission school before it closed. I learned your laws, your constitution, your founding principles. And I learned that America was supposed to be different from the empires that came before, that here justice would be blind to wealth and station. She produced the piece of hide that started everything, the fragment of the hide map that Kaya had shown Jack days ago. This is part of a map my father protected with his life. It shows water sources that white ranchers would kill to control, silver veins that would make poor men wealthy. But it also shows our sacred burial ground where the treaty is hidden and where my ancestors have rested for 400 years. Whitmore examined the hide, tracing the symbols with one finger. What do you propose? Let us retrieve the full treaty. Let archaeologists verify the burial ground. Let surveyors confirm the water sources and silver deposits. Build your case not on testimony alone, but on physical evidence so overwhelming that even bought lawyers can't dismiss it. Parker was nodding, his legal training recognizing the strategy. She's right. We need corroboration, chain of custody for evidence, expert witnesses who can't be impeached. It'll take time, but it's the only way to guarantee conviction. Whitmore considered this, his fingers drumming on his desk in a pattern that suggested he was working through scenarios and probabilities. How long to retrieve the treaty and document the burial ground? Winona looked at her sisters, a silent conversation passing between them. The burial ground is 4 days' ride into territory Callahan's men patrol constantly. Retrieving the treaty requires a blood ritual that only the 7th daughter can perform, and we'd need to bring my father because he knows the precise location within the burial complex. Call it a week, maybe 10 days to get there, perform the ceremony, and return with documentation. And Callahan will fight you every step. He's not stupid. He knows what you're planning. Kaya's smile was predatory. Let him fight. We've been fighting him for 7 years. Another 10 days changes nothing. Jack watched the general calculate, seeing the same weighing of options he'd done 1,000 times himself. The conservative play was to hold position, build the legal case slowly, avoid risk. The aggressive play was to strike while Callahan was off balance, before he could marshal his resources and political allies. Whitmore had the look of a man who'd made his career on aggressive plays. All right, I'll give you military escort. 20 men experienced in Indian Territory operations. They'll protect you to the burial ground and back. In exchange, you agree to federal authority over the site. No looting, no unauthorized access. Everything documented by my archaeologist and surveyor. Kaya bristled at the word looting, but Samuel placed a calming hand on her shoulder. We agree, our ancestors' rest is sacred to us. We have no interest in disturbing them beyond retrieving what was hidden for this exact purpose. Whitmore stood, signaling the meeting's end. You leave tomorrow at dawn. Marshal Morrison, you're staying here. Those wounds need proper treatment or you'll be dead before the week is out. Jack started to protest, but Red's hand on his arm stopped him. The general's right. You're burning with fever and can barely stand. Let the young ones handle this part. The words stung because they were true. Jack had felt his strength waning for days, each mile draining reserves he no longer possessed. His body was failing him the way all bodies failed eventually. Time and violence exacting their inevitable toll. I'm not done yet. No one said you were, but you're no good to anyone dead. Rest. Heal. Let Parker and the women do what needs doing. That night, Jack lay in the post-hospital while an army surgeon cleaned his wounds properly, cutting away infected tissue with a scalpel and cauterizing with a hot iron that made Jack bite down on leather to avoid screaming. The surgeon was competent but brutal, treating flesh like it was material to be repaired rather than part of a living man. Red sat beside the bed afterward, sharing a bottle of whiskey he'd liberated from the officer's mess. You thinking about Emma? The question came without preamble, the way conversations between old friends often did. Always am, can't help it. She'd be proud of you. What you're doing here? Jack took a pull from the bottle, letting the burn distract from the deeper pain in his chest. Or she'd think I'm a damn fool, throwing away my pension for people I barely know. Those are the people worth dying for, the ones you choose instead of the ones you're ordered to protect. When did you become a philosopher? Same time you became a rebel. We're both too old for this, you know. I know. They drank in silence, two old soldiers waiting for whatever came next. Through the window, Jack could see preparations for the expedition, horses being loaded, supplies counted and recounted, the 7 women checking weapons with the focus of people who understood that mistakes cost lives. Parker appeared in the doorway, his young face uncertain. Sir, Morrison, can I ask you something? You're asking permission to ask permission? Just spit it out, kid. Back at the mission when Thorne had his gun on you and you could have killed him but didn't. Why'd you hesitate? The question deserved an honest answer even if honesty made Jack uncomfortable. Because killing him would have been easy, would have felt good in the moment, but it wouldn't have changed anything. Another Thorne would have come along and another after that because the system that created him would still exist. But the system doesn't work. You said so yourself. I said it's broken. Didn't say it can't be fixed. That's what you're doing with all that paperwork. Building a case so strong that even the broken system has to deliver justice. That's harder than killing. Takes longer. Hurts more. But it's the only way to make change that lasts. Parker absorbed this, his expression suggesting he was filing the words away for future reference. What if it doesn't work? What if we do everything right and Callahan still walks free? Jack met the young marshal's eyes and saw his own doubts reflected there. Then we did everything right and can sleep at night knowing we tried. That's all any of us can do. The expedition departed at dawn, 20 cavalry troopers led by a captain named Stone, plus the 7 women, Samuel, Dakota riding in a wagon, and Parker as federal representative. Red went with them because someone needed to keep the young marshal alive, and the women trusted him more than they trusted the soldiers. Jack watched from the hospital window as they rode out, a column of purpose disappearing into heat shimmer. Then he slept for 16 hours straight, his body demanding payment for abuse it had endured. He woke to find Harrington sitting beside his bed reading a newspaper. "You snore, thought you should know. Add it to my list of charms. What's the news?" Harrington folded the paper, his expression grim. "Callahan knows. Posted reward for the 7 women. $5,000 each, dead or alive. Claims they're escaped prisoners from territorial custody. With Thorne in custody, Callahan's scrambling. Posted the bounty yesterday, same day we locked Thorne in the stockade. He's throwing money at the problem, hiring every gun hand and bounty hunter from here to El Paso." Jack's jaw tightened. Thorne behind bars should have weakened Callahan's position. Instead, it had made the mining tycoon desperate. And desperate men with unlimited resources were more dangerous than confident ones. "How many men we talking?" "Reports say 50, maybe 60. Mix of professional bounty hunters and Callahan's mine guards. They're not coordinated like Thorne's outfit was, but they're motivated by 5,000 reasons per woman." Harrington pulled out a telegram from his jacket. This came from Captain Stone an hour before his scout arrived. Said they spotted multiple groups converging on their position. Callahan must have had spotters watching the burial ground, waiting for them to retrieve the treaty. That's a lie. Of course it's a lie, but it's a lie backed by money, and money makes people believe things they know aren't true. Every bounty hunter in 3 territories will be looking for them now. Jack forced himself upright despite protests from his wounds. "I need to go after them. Warn them. You need to stay in that bed before you split yourself open again. Captain Stone knows about the bounty. He'll keep them safe. Stone has 20 men. Callahan probably has 50 hunting those women right now. 20 soldiers, 7 Apache, 1 old man, 1 invalid chieftain, and 1 kid marshal. Those aren't good odds." Harrington's silence acknowledged the truth. Then he reached into his jacket and pulled out a folded document. "This came by special courier from Denver this morning. Seems someone sent a full report of events to the Justice Department. Detailed accounting of the massacre, the mines, everything. That someone was very thorough. Parker? Before he left Tucson, apparently. Kid's smarter than he looks. Justice Department is sending a senior prosecutor to handle the case personally. Man named Thornton, best corruption prosecutor in the federal system. He'll be here in 2 weeks." Jack felt something unclench in his chest, a tension he'd been carrying since finding the 7 women under that cottonwood tree. So if they can just stay alive for 2 weeks, we have a real chance. If. That's doing a lot of work in that sentence. The days crawled by with agonizing slowness. Jack's wounds healed because he was too stubborn to let them kill him. He walked the fort's perimeter until his legs stopped screaming, practiced drawing his Colt until his hand regained its steadiness. Read Parker's documentation until he'd memorized every detail that would be needed for trial. On the 8th day, a rider came in hard, his horse lathered and blowing. Captain Stone's scout bringing news that churned Jack's stomach. They'd reached the burial ground without incident. Winona had performed the blood ritual, whatever that entailed. The treaty had been retrieved along with extensive documentation of the sacred site. But on the return journey, they'd been ambushed by a force of approximately 60 men, a combination of bounty hunters and Callahan's private army. The cavalry detachment had held long enough for the women and Samuel to escape with the treaty, but Captain Stone was dead. 8 of his men were dead. The survivors had retreated to a defensive position in a box canyon called Devil's Gate, where they were now besieged with dwindling ammunition and no water source. Harrington was already mobilizing a relief force before the scout finished his report, but Jack knew the arithmetic. Devil's Gate was 2 days' hard ride. Stone's men might have ammunition for another day if they rationed carefully. Math said they'd all be dead before help arrived. The colonel looked at Jack with an expression that held both respect and resignation. "I can't order you to do anything. You're technically not even under my command. But you're thinking a small force moving fast might get there before a large force moving slow. I'm thinking a man who's spent 35 years as a marshal might know how to move through hostile territory better than a cavalry column that kicks up dust, visible for 20 miles. Jack was already moving toward the door, his body's protest ignored through sheer force of will. "I'll need horses, fresh ones, supplies for 4 days. "You'll have them, but Morrison, even if you reach them, what then? You'll be trapped same as they are. Then I'll be trapped doing what I should have been doing from the start, protecting the people who can't protect themselves. Red found him in the stable saddling Sherman, the old gelding looking as skeptical about the plan as any human might. You're going. It wasn't a question. Can't let them die alone. Figured you'd say that. Saddled my horse already. Jack looked at his oldest friend, seeing the same determination that had carried them through Gettysburg and every nightmare since. This isn't your fight. Like hell it's not. Those women saved my life at the mission, same as they saved yours. I pay my debts. They rode out within the hour, just the two of them, carrying extra ammunition and medical supplies, but leaving behind everything that would slow them down. The desert unfolded in its familiar patterns of beauty and menace, arroyos that could hide ambushes, mesas that offered observation points, the endless sky that made men feel small and temporary. They rode through the night, navigating by stars that had guided travelers for millennia. Stopped only to water the horses and check their back trail for pursuit. Spoke little because there was nothing that needed saying, the silence between them more eloquent than words. Dawn of the second day found them approaching Devil's Gate from the south. The route Callahan's men wouldn't be watching because it required climbing terrain that horses couldn't manage. They left their mounts hidden in a draw and proceeded on foot, Jack's knee howling protest at every step. The canyon opened before them like a wound in the earth, sheer walls rising 300 feet on three sides, with only one entrance that Callahan's men had locked down with overlapping fields of fire. Jack counted positions through his spyglass. 40 men minimum, maybe more hidden in dead ground. They'd set up for a siege, which meant they were confident time was on their side. Inside the canyon, he could make out the cavalry survivors, maybe a dozen men behind improvised barricades of dead horses and piled stones. The 7 women were there, their positions marked by occasional movement. Parker's bright blue cavalry coat stood out like a target. Samuel and Dakota had found shelter in a cave mouth. Red studied the setup with a tracker's eye. They can't get out. Callahan's men control the only exit and have enough ammunition to hold for a week. But Callahan can't get in either without taking casualties he's not willing to pay. Stalemate. Until someone gets desperate or thirsty enough to try something stupid. Jack glassed the canyon again, looking for angles and opportunities. What he saw made his blood run cold. Callahan's men were building something at the canyon mouth, a structure of logs and pitch that could only be one thing. They're going to burn them out. The realization hit like a physical blow. Callahan's men would set fires at the canyon entrance, and the wind that funneled through would turn the box canyon into an oven. Anyone who didn't suffocate from smoke would be driven into the open where rifles would cut them down. It was brutal and effective and completely lacking in honor. We need to stop them before they light those fires. 2 of us against 40? You got a better idea? Red's grin was sharp as a knife's edge. Yeah, we do what we did at Chancellorsville, remember? Jack remembered, the Union flank collapsing under Confederate assault, their company trapped behind enemy lines. They'd created chaos by attacking from an unexpected direction, making the Confederates think a larger force was hitting their rear. In the confusion, they'd punch through and rejoin their lines. That was 25 years ago, and we had 100 men. We had surprise and audacity. Still got both of those. They worked out the details quickly. Red would circle to the east rim and start shooting from elevation, making Callahan's men think they were under attack from that direction. Jack would use the distraction to infiltrate the camp and sabotage the fire structure. Simple, desperate, likely to get them both killed. Jack checked his Colt one final time, the ritual grounding him the way it always did before violence. If this goes wrong, it won't. But if it does, I want you to know. I know, same here. Now quit being sentimental and let's go kill some sons of bitches. They split up, Red climbing toward his position, while Jack descended into the labyrinth of boulders and gullies that surrounded Devil's Gate. He moved slowly despite the urgency, knowing that haste meant noise and noise meant death. Every step was calculated, every movement deliberate. He reached the perimeter of Callahan's camp as the sun climbed toward noon, the heat already intense enough to shimmer off rocks. The men were relaxed, confident in their numbers and position. That confidence would be their mistake. Red's first shot cracked across the canyon, the sound echoing off stone walls until it seemed to come from everywhere at once. A man on the east perimeter dropped, Red's bullet taking him clean through the throat. The second shot followed immediately, catching another man in the leg. Chaos erupted as 40 men scrambled for cover, convinced they were under attack by a larger force. Officers shouted contradictory orders. Men fired at shadows and wind-stirred bushes. In the confusion, Jack slipped through their perimeter like smoke. The fire structure was massive, hundreds of pounds of pitch-soaked wood ready to turn the canyon into hell. Two guards stood watch over it, nervous young men who kept glancing toward the gunfire. Jack approached from their blind side, moving with patience born from decades of hunting men. The first guard died without knowing Jack was there, a knife between his ribs piercing his heart. The second turned at the sound of his partner falling, and Jack's Colt spoke. The shot lost in the general gunfire, echoing through the canyon. Jack caught the falling body and lowered it quietly. He had minutes at best before someone noticed the guards were gone. He pulled a canteen from his belt and began dousing the pitch. The oil-based mixture resistant to water, but not impossible to neutralize with enough liquid. He used every drop from 3 canteens taken from the dead guards, working frantically. A shout behind him. Discovery. Jack spun and fired, his bullet catching the approaching man in the shoulder. Then he was running, Callahan's men converging on his position from 3 directions. Bullets kicked up dust at his heels. One grazed his already wounded arm, reopening flesh that had barely started to heal. He dove behind a boulder as rifles concentrated on his position, pinned down with nowhere to go. This was it then. The end that had been waiting since Gettysburg, just delayed by decades in luck that had finally run out. Then the canyon erupted with Apache war cries and rifle fire from multiple directions. The 7 women had seen Jack's infiltration and launched their own attack, pouring out of their defensive position to hit Callahan's men from the flank. Kaya led the charge, her knife flashing in sunlight. Naira moved like wind through grass, appearing and disappearing each time another of Callahan's men fell. The siege transformed into a battlefield, close quarters chaos where numbers mattered less than skill and desperation. Parker was there, his young face set in determined lines, firing his rifle with the methodical precision of a man who'd learned to control fear. The surviving cavalry troopers fixed bayonets and advanced in a line that would have made their drill instructors proud. Jack pushed himself upright and rejoined the fight, his Colt bucking in his hand until the hammer fell on an empty chamber. He drew his knife and waded into the melee, fighting with the economical brutality of a man who'd survived too many battles to waste energy on flourishes. A bounty hunter came at him with a club. Jack sidestepped and opened the man's femoral artery with a slash that was medical in its precision. Another charge with a knife, and Jack caught his wrist, twisted, and drove his own blade up under the man's sternum. The violence was ugly and intimate, the kind that left scars on souls as well as bodies. But it was also necessary, the only language that men like Callahan's mercenaries understood. Jack had made peace with that necessity decades ago, had accepted that sometimes the only way to protect the innocent was to become the thing that monsters feared. Callahan's men broke. Faced with attackers who refused to die, who kept coming despite wounds and odds, their mercenary courage evaporated. They scattered on horseback, riding hard for anywhere else, leaving their dead behind in the dust. The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the moans of wounded and the harsh breathing of exhausted combatants. Jack stood among the carnage and felt nothing. No triumph, no satisfaction, just the familiar emptiness that always came after killing, the knowledge that he'd taken lives and been diminished by it even when necessity justified the act. Kaya approached, her face spattered with blood that wasn't hers. You came. Couldn't let you have all the fun. She almost smiled, a fractional movement that acknowledged the absurdity of calling any of this fun. My father says he wants to speak with you. Before we return. Dakota sat in the cave mouth, Samuel beside him, both old men looking ancient in the afternoon light. The chieftain's single eye found Jack and held him with an intensity that suggested he was seeing more than surface details. He spoke in Apache, Samuel translating. My brother says you are a man who has lost his way and found it again. That Emma would be proud of the path you walk now. Jack's breath caught. He'd never mentioned Emma's name to anyone here. Couldn't have. But somehow this old man who'd been tortured for 7 years knew anyway. Saw it in Jack's eyes or heard it in his silences. My brother says the treaty we retrieved is not the only treasure we carry. That the real treasure is the choice you made when you cut 7 ropes and refused to ride away. The words hit harder than bullets, opening wounds that had never properly healed. Jack found himself on his knees without remembering the decision to kneel, grief and exhaustion, and something like relief all pouring out of him in shaking sobs that he couldn't control. Dakota's hand rested on his head, a benediction from a man who understood suffering and survival. Samuel's voice was gentle. He says Emma lives in what you do, in who you save. That graves are for bodies, but souls survive in actions that echo across time. They returned to Fort Grant 3 days later, the treaty secured in a leather case that never left Parker's possession. General Whitmore received them with visible relief, and 2 days after that, Senior Prosecutor Thornton arrived from Denver. The trial began on a Monday morning in late October, 6 weeks after the Devil's Gate siege. Federal courthouse in Tucson, packed gallery, every seat taken. Outside, crowds gathered 3 deep on the courthouse steps. A mix of miners who'd worked Callahan's claims, Apache families who'd lost loved ones, and curiosity seekers drawn by the spectacle of Arizona Territory's wealthiest man facing a hangman's noose. Senior Prosecutor Thornton was everything his reputation promised. 58 years old, gray-haired, with the patient manner of a man who'd spent 3 decades building cases brick by brick until the walls were too high to climb. He laid out the evidence with surgical precision. Week 1, the massacre. Samuel testified for 2 days, his English perfect, his memory devastating. Callahan's defense attorney, a slick Easterner named Harrigan, tried to impeach him on cross-examination. Mr. Whitehorse, you claim to have witnessed these events from 50 miles away. I witnessed the aftermath, the bodies, the ash, the 14 survivors who died in the mines over 7 years. Each one told me what happened before they passed. Hearsay, Your Honor. Judge Blackwell, a federal appointee immune to Callahan's influence, shook his head. Dying declarations are admissible, counselor. You know that. Week 2, the mines. Thornton produced 23 witnesses, former miners who testified about the Apache prisoners, the brutal conditions, the children forced to work until they collapsed. Harrigan attacked their credibility, called them disgruntled employees seeking revenge. But Parker's documentation was meticulous. Pay records showing Apache workers paid nothing. Death certificates filed under false names. Mine shaft maps with a section marked restricted, where the prisoners had been kept. Week 3, the treaty. Historians from 3 universities authenticated the document. Presidential seal verified. Polk's signature matched samples from the National Archives. The implications were staggering. 500,000 acres. Every mine Callahan operated was on stolen land. Harrigan's defense was simple. Callahan had purchased the land in good faith from the territorial government. How was he to know an obscure treaty from 1848 invalidated those sales? My client is a businessman, not a historian. But Thornton was ready. The defendant knew about the treaty. That's why he ordered the massacre. That's why he tortured Dakota for 7 years trying to locate it. That's why he posted a $5,000 bounty on 7 Apache women whose only crime was trying to prove their land was stolen. Week 4, Thorn. The corrupt sheriff sat in the witness box, hands shackled, face pale. Thornton gave him a choice. Testify truthfully and avoid the noose, or protect Callahan and hang beside him. Thorn broke, told everything. The night of the massacre, Callahan's orders, the torture chamber beneath the sheriff's office, the bounty hunters hired to kill the 7 women. Harrigan tried damage control on cross. Sheriff Thorne, you're testifying in exchange for leniency, correct? I'm testifying because I'm tired of being Callahan's dog. Week 5, Callahan's turn. The mining tycoon took the stand against Harrigan's advice. Unable to resist defending his empire, big mistake. Thornton circled like a patient wolf. Mr. Callahan, you claimed ignorance of the treaty, yet your private library contains 14 books on Apache history, including 3 that specifically mentioned President Polk's negotiations with tribal leaders in 1848. Curious reading for a man who claims no knowledge. I collect books. Doesn't mean I read them. Your foreman testified that in 1879, a year before the massacre, you asked him specifically about Apache burial grounds and whether they might contain hidden documents. Why would you ask that if you didn't know about the treaty? Callahan's composure cracked. Rumors. I heard rumors. So you heard rumors of a treaty that could invalidate your land claims, and 1 year later, coincidentally, the entire Apache village protecting that treaty was massacred. And you expect this jury to believe you had nothing to do with it? Silence. Callahan's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. Week 6, closing arguments. Harrigan painted his client as a victim of circumstances, a builder of civilization being destroyed by Apache revanchists and corrupt lawmen seeking glory. Thornton's rebuttal was devastating. Gentlemen of the jury, the defense would have you believe this is complicated. It's not. A man wanted land. The law said that land belonged to others. So he murdered everyone who could prove it. 73 people dead. 14 worked to death. 7 women nearly hanged. All because Silas Callahan decided his wealth mattered more than their lives. He paused, letting the words sink in. You have a choice. You can let money purchase innocence, as it has in every territorial court in Arizona. Or you can send a message that in federal court, justice is not for sale. The jury deliberated for 7 hours. Jack spent that time in the courthouse hallway with Red, Samuel, the 7 women, and Dakota. No one spoke much. The wait was torture of its own kind. When the foreman stood to deliver the verdict, you could have heard a pin drop in the courtroom. On the charge of conspiracy to commit murder, guilty. On the charge of operating a slave labor camp, guilty. On the charge of fraud and illegal land acquisition, guilty. 12 counts. 12 guilty verdicts. Callahan's face went white as chalk. Judge Blackwell's voice was iron. Silas Callahan, you are sentenced to life imprisonment at the federal penitentiary in Leavenworth, Kansas. Marcus Thorne, having cooperated with this court, you are sentenced to 25 years hard labor. Your 3 lieutenants are sentenced to hang by the neck until dead, execution to be carried out at dawn, 3 days hence. The courtroom erupted. Some cheered, some wept. Callahan sat stunned, as if unable to comprehend that his money had finally failed him. Jack attended the hanging because someone needed to witness that justice, however delayed, sometimes arrived. Thorne died cursing, his last words a stream of profanity that meant nothing. The trap dropped and the rope did its work, and another monster left the world. Afterward, on the courthouse steps, Jack stood with the 7 women and Samuel and Dakota. Parker was there too, already assigned to a new case, but promising to visit when duties allowed. Red leaned against a post, smoking a cigar and looking satisfied. What will you do now? Kaya's question was directed at Jack, but everyone waited for the answer. Thought I'd retire, buy a little piece of land, somewhere quiet. You have earned rest. What about you 7? We rebuild our village, teach the children, tell the stories so no one forgets. Dakota spoke, Samuel translating. He says you are always welcome in Apache lands, that you saved his daughters when the world wanted them dead. That makes you family. Jack felt tears threatening again and pushed them down. Never had much family. I'll treasure that. The 7 women approached one by one, each offering something. Kaya gave him a knife made from bone, Naira a pair of moccasins, Ayasha a pouch of healing herbs, Liluye an arrow she'd fletched herself, Winona a book of Apache stories written in English, Chinoa a stone from the burial ground, Kimimela a piece of hide painted with symbols that meant protection. Jack accepted each gift with the solemnity it deserved, understanding that he was receiving more than objects. He was receiving acceptance, trust, the kind of belonging he'd thought died with Sarah and Emma. They parted at the crossroads, the 7 women and Samuel and Dakota heading east toward Apache lands, while Jack and Red turned south toward Tucson and whatever came after. 5 years passed. Jack bought his ranch on the border of Apache territory, a small spread where he raised horses and grew vegetables and learned that peace was louder than war in its demands on a man's character. Red visited often, the two old soldiers content to sit in silence and watch sunsets that painted the desert in colors they'd earned the right to appreciate. Ayasha came one autumn morning, her horse picking its way down the trail that led to Jack's cabin. She'd grown into her features, the anger that had defined her replaced by something calmer, but no less fierce. Kaya is getting married, Apache ceremony. She wants you to come. Jack set down the harness he'd been mending. Me, I'm just an old white man. You are family. Also, Parker is marrying Winona. Double ceremony. Jack couldn't help but smile. Those two didn't see that coming. Love grows where justice is planted. Your father teach you that? You did, the day you cut the ropes. The wedding was beautiful in its simplicity. Two couples joining lives under desert sky while their families watched. Jack stood with Red and Samuel, three old men who'd survived long enough to see something good grow from ashes. Dakota found him after the ceremony, the old chieftain moving slowly but with dignity restored. He spoke and Samuel translated. He says to tell you that Emma would be proud, that the legacy we leave is not in what we take, but in what we give, that you gave 7 daughters their lives and their father his freedom. That is enough for any man. Jack rode back to his ranch the next day, Ayasha's words echoing in his mind. The graves in Texas still held Sarah and Emma, but they no longer pulled at him with the weight of unfinished business. He'd found his answer to the question that had haunted him since they died. Not revenge. Not justice that looked like revenge, but the simple act of choosing to save lives instead of taking them, even when taking would have been easier. He was feeding his horses when Parker arrived a week later, now wearing a senior marshal's badge and carrying it himself with the confidence that came from surviving impossible odds. Sir? Marshal Morrison? Mr. Morrison now, I suppose. Just Jack is fine. Jack, then, I wanted to ask your advice. There's a situation in New Mexico territory. Group of settlers being forced off land by a railroad company. Looks like another Callahan situation, just smaller scale. Jack studied the young man who'd been scared and uncertain 5 years ago, but now stood straight and sure. What does the law say? Law says the railroad has proper deeds, but the deeds were acquired through fraud and intimidation, so the law is wrong. Then you know what to do. Do I? Jack placed a hand on Parker's shoulder, the gesture carrying weight earned through shared danger. You do what's right. Build your case. Gather your evidence. Give the system a chance to work. And if the system fails, you make sure justice happens anyway. One way or another. Parker nodded, understanding flowing between them. Will you come? Lend your experience? Jack looked at his ranch, at the horses that needed feeding and the fence that needed mending. Looked at the peace he'd built from violence and grief. Then he looked at Parker and saw the same earnest determination that had saved 7 Apache women and brought down an empire. Let me saddle my horse. Some men retired to die slowly. Others found that retirement was just another word for choosing which battles mattered. Jack Morrison had spent 35 years believing in law and order, then learned that sometimes law and order meant different things. He'd lost a family and found another. Lost a badge and found a purpose. He rode toward New Mexico territory with Parker, heading toward trouble that needed fixing and wrongs that needed righting. The sunset behind them painted the desert gold and red, beautiful and merciless, like justice when it finally arrived. Behind him in Apache lands, 7 women told stories to their children about the marshal who cut 7 ropes and refused to look away. About the choice that defined a man when nothing required him to choose right except his own conscience. About how sometimes salvation came not from angels, but from broken men who decided that broken could be enough if you used the pieces to build something better. Jack Morrison's badge hung on a wall in Winona's house, framed beside a photo of 11 people who'd been strangers and became family. The caption beneath, carved in wood by Samuel's patient hands, read simply, Family, 1887. The word wasn't defined by blood or law or any external force. It was defined by choice, by the decision to stand with those who needed standing with, to fight for those who couldn't fight alone, to believe that justice was worth pursuing, even when the pursuit cost everything. Jack had made that choice under a cottonwood tree in the desert, and in choosing, He'd found the answer to the question that had haunted him since Texas. Not why Sarah and Emma died, but what their lives meant, what any life meant. They meant that every choice mattered, every rope you cut, every hand you extended, every time you chose hard, right over easy wrong. The sun set, the desert cooled, and Jack Morrison rode on, in an old man with new purpose, carrying Emma's memory in actions that echoed across time like ripples in still water, spreading outward forever.